this is the title of the talk, and I appreciate anyone who read that and came here because it's a bit kind of cryptic. But this is basically the story of debris. So you're on the bus or on the subway, you see something move in the corner of your eye, and you feel this bristle of anticipation. You know something's going down, there's this weird energy in the air, someone is behaving abnormally, causing a commotion. Deep breath, this is a crisis. Whether it's talking to themselves, making noises, disrupting others, or even becoming violent, I'm sure most of us can remember the feeling of having to deal with someone suffering through a mental episode in public, being a so-called innocent bystander. For me, 4 words always jump to mind. What do I do? Now you may be thinking, oh, please don't have this dude try to pitch a VR trauma simulator at Games for Change. No, I promise. Developing this game has not answered the question of what to do in these situations. But it has dramatically changed how I think about and approach them. And that's what I'd like to talk about. My name's Nick. Thank you all very much for coming. For the past 3 years or so, we've been working on a game called Debris. It's out on Steam. And it was designed with the hopes of raising awareness for psychosis. Right off the bat, I'm not a doctor, and my experience at the intersection of games and mental illness is intense but short. Throughout the development of Debris, we had the privilege of working with 2 medical professionals. We were also overseen by an advisory committee with members of local youth shelters and mental health associations. I feel confident this group has a pretty good idea of how mental illness has been portrayed historically in games. So, short answer, not great. Last year, Dr. Manuela Ferrari, who we worked with, and her colleagues at the Douglas Mental Health University Institute in Montreal, Quebec, examined mental illness messages, especially about psychosis in commercial video games. They identified 106 games on Steam that fit their criteria, all released between 2016 and 2017. That's almost 10 games a month on Steam only, whose game content directly relates to mental illness. Unsurprisingly, they found that several games portrayed, quote, well-known negative stereotypes and prejudices associated with mental illness, namely that those with mental illness, especially psychosis, are violent, isolated, and fearful, while also promoting the creation of new ones, such as mental illness involves or is caused by supernatural or paranormal experiences. I'm sure you can think of games that include these elements. This is thankfully changing. The industry is putting out a lot of really interesting work that tackles serious issues seriously. Some of them are actually moving copies too, like the Games for Change award winner Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, which just recently passed 1 million sales. And this is huge, because it proves to studios, it proves to everyone that people are looking for these kinds of experiences. Given how big the industry has been for decades, it's about time. That brings us back to Debris. This is not Debris. This is Harry's Journey. Harry's Journey is an interactive project created by Dr. Suzanne Archie, the clinical director of the Cleghorn Early Intervention in Psychosis program at St. Joseph's Healthcare in Hamilton, Ontario. Dr. Archie came by our studio and showed us a version of Harry's Journey, where you play through the day in the life of a teen who suffers from psychosis. It was honestly terrifying. There's this popular CNN clip where Anderson Cooper subjects himself to a quote-unquote schizophrenia simulator, which is basically a set of headphones playing a selection of typical voices one would encounter if they were suffering from psychosis. After a few minutes, he's asked to build a folded paper house, and he gives up. He can't even remember what day it is. Anderson Cooper. He also knew that the voices in the simulator weren't real. So, I mean, how much of a simulation can it be when you're aware that it's fake and it's not your experience? Harry's Journey shows a similar experience, but through the lens of a teen in high school dealing with the added pressure of being a teen in high school. Harry's Journey, however, was not built for gamers. It was designed, and I'm quoting from the project page, to simulate a multitude of emotional and perceptual experiences associated with psychosis. So how can we get this message to a wider audience? What if players didn't know that what they were experiencing represented psychosis? How else can games look at this concept? And this is what led to Debris. But first, let me try to pitch the game to you as if we were on the convention floor. Pretend, if you will, for a brief moment, that you are a mere gamer. It's the near future. Somehow, there are still ice sheets left unfrozen. A meteor explodes in the atmosphere, scattering alien debris in the Arctic ice. Unusually radioactive, the fragments melt the surrounding ice and bore holes into the bedrock, creating large glacial cave systems full of powerful convectional currents. A sleek, disruptive energy company called Alta discovers the site and lays claim. Initial research into the strange debris yields surprising results. Looks like it's an uncharacteristically efficient power source. Alta predicts that this miraculous debris will change everything, locks the site down, and develops state-of-the-art extraction technology. Being an energy company and knowing the power of PR, Alta hires a small team to film promotional footage for an upcoming public announcement. The team consists of Ryan, a sought-after videographer, Sonia, a supremely competent Alta engineer, and Chris, one of Alta's more articulate theoretical physicists. You play as Ryan. In co-op, your partner plays as Sonia. Chris is a friendly NPC. Something goes wrong at the dive site, and you find yourself disoriented at the bottom of an underwater ice cave network, lost and separated from the rest of your team. We want to show empathy, compassion, patience, and trust can be effective tools to work through psychosis symptoms until more help is available. You might be thinking, accomplishing all this at a small studio with a new team on your first 3D game sounds impossible. How did you manage to pull it off? We didn't really pull it off. I will be the first to say that Debris is far from a perfect game. But there are some things that worked really well. Things that I'm supremely excited to share with you, things that I don't know I've seen anywhere else in games. We'll start with the constructing reality with delusions, and then go to my main point, co-op. A common trope in games, and especially games that deal with mental illness, is deciphering what is real, what is true. I mean, it's really one of the core concepts in all media. Westworld, Rashomon, you could go on forever with examples. Now, most people will say that games are ideally suited to this type of narrative because agency allows for trial and error, failure and success, immersion via action. I would say that too, that's true, that's definitely true. But with Debris, we wanted to play into this as much as possible. The aesthetic and structural elements of the game, the sci-fi world, the dramatic, fantastic setting, the mysterious catastrophe, are generic by design. The narrative beats are second nature to gamers. A crisis, rising action, truth coming into question, a climax, and a reckoning. You're interested in the story to see where it goes. And this is where delusions come into play. A common symptom of psychosis is systematic or systematized delusions. Systematic meaning a holistic understanding of reality itself. Instead of disconnected individual hallucinations, each hallucination plays into a structural understanding, like many gears of a delusional machine. You see a van outside, it's the FBI. You hear high-pitched squealing, it's cameras or surveillance equipment. You see a stranger make eye contact in the street, and they're spying on you. One of the key things we learned is that when you're suffering from psychosis, your reality is real. That sounds obvious, but it's very important. A common reaction to someone experiencing a break in reality is to reinforce what's actually going on. Oh, don't worry, you're just seeing things. Don't worry, that's not real. There's nothing there. You're just imagining it, and that kind of thing. The problem is, this kind of reaction, even if well-intentioned, can make things much worse. When forced to intervene during a mental crisis, there's a strong case to approach things from a more empathetic perspective. Knowing that reality has to feel real, how do you do this in a medium where players are often conditioned to question reality? In Debris, we do it through player-directed delusions based on real-life symptoms. So, in Debris, there are 4 primary delusions, one for each ending. We based each delusion on common real-life examples. So, first is the delusion of grandeur, grandiosity, where you think you're special or invisible. Second is the delusion of control, where you think you're being controlled by some outside force. Third is the delusion of persecution, where you think someone or something is out to get you. The fourth is a somatic delusion, where you think something is affecting your body, like a parasite, for example. This structure also helps reinforce how each individual's experience of psychosis is unique. There is no canonical experience. And also, the 4 delusions are scattered along the spectrum of manic, such as grandiosity, versus depressive, which is more somatic. Now, 4 delusions, 4 endings. How do players get there? How do they choose their delusion? The power and choice, don't try to read this. It wouldn't be good even if you did. But it looks like choices. The power of choice in games when it comes to immersion is obvious. We all have examples of moments where we were forced to make a choice, no matter how meaningless, and we felt something. It's cliche, but destroying your companion cube in Portal and feeling remorse is a great example of that. The way we do this in Debris is by tying choices to action. Instead of a conversation system, every choice in the game is tied to a movement. We did this for two reasons. One, to reduce the number of immersion-breaking, non-diegetic UI pop-ups, and two, to downplay the importance of choices. Because we don't want role play, we want reaction. We want instinct. Then we reinforce these instincts so they create the delusion. For example, if you think the company in the game, Alta, is evil and trying to kill you, you will react a certain way when you see certain things, such as an aggressive mutated fish, or you hear the sound of a strange signal. Then, once you react, the world changes for the character that's suffering from psychosis to accommodate that interpretation. This reinforcement further convinces you that you're right. Basically, the player is always right. The world conforms to their behavior and intuition with the hopes of immersing them into their reality as much as possible. So they think they're solving the world because they are, always, in the hopes that they believe their reality is canonical. For example, your equipment keeps malfunctioning. Is Alta trying to sabotage the mission? Or is it the radiation of the alien debris that's interfering with everything? Both reactions lead down separate paths and eventually to separate endpoints for the player who's suffering from psychosis. For better or for worse, we decided to unveil the reality of psychosis to players at the end of the game. Up to that point, there's no talk of psychosis, and players don't actually know that that's going on. And a quick aside about voices. A frequent experience of psychosis sufferers is a gradual and dramatic shift in the tone and attitude of voices. So voices are frequently triggered as a response to a traumatic event, often at a young age. These voices are initially coping mechanisms and can be positive. But what happens in a lot of cases is eventually they turn on the person suffering, become antagonistic. Their attitude changes, the tone changes. So effectively, they can betray the person they were manifested to help and give into and add to the trauma. So in Debris, we wanted to portray this reality as well. If you're playing as the character who's suffering from psychosis, there is a voice that is a character who you think is still alive, but spoiler alert, did not make it, is manifested to help you cope with the trauma of being stuck. That player starts out as sympathetic and compassionate, and depending on the delusion that you fall into, will change their attitude. So if it's a grandiosity, if you feel like a delusion of grandeur, the voice will cheer you on and say that you're a hero and you've done everything right. If it's a somatic delusion, it will convince you that you're past the point of no return, that there's no way for you to get out. At the end, the truth is revealed. One character experienced an accelerated first episode psychosis event. One character died at the outset and was revived as a hallucinated voice, and one character intervened when necessary with patience and compassion. You made it to the surface, you survived. But the game doesn't end with silence. The voices remain. And it's important because it's not a game where you cure or beat psychosis. In reality, that's not something we want to show. And with voices especially, curing might not even be an appropriate term entirely. So watching players go through this was really cool. Particularly interesting was seeing YouTubers whose channel thrive on horror jump scares and hype finish the game and end with serious, kind of thoughtful postmortems where they talk about the content of the game. And also the commenters who were following along for the ride after theory crafting the whole time about what's going on reflect on the choices that were made and the content with the new lens of psychosis being added onto it. Keep that in mind that the feedback wasn't all good. You can get negative reviews for being a quote-unquote mental illness PSA, which I'm fine with. I'll deal with that. Anyways, most of these reactions are from the single-player mode. Players are used to experiencing multiple canonical realities. They're used to pausing, saving, going back, trying something else. They're used to save scumming. They're used to playing through a story multiple times to get every ending. It's well explored in single-player games to experience separate realities. Because there's one player, it's serialized, there's one experience. But what happens when you parallelize two subjective realities? How do people make it through a traumatic situation when they're not even experiencing the same reality? This was Debris Co-op. For example, there's one sequence in the game where players enter this large cavern with a large pile of debris. If you're playing as the characters not suffering, that's all you see. It's a pretty empty room. But if you're playing for the character who's suffering from psychosis, you see a severe hallucination of the particular delusion that you're trapped within. For example, if you're experiencing delusion of persecution, the pile is being guarded by these enemies that are controlled by the company, essentially. If you're experiencing the somatic delusion, the debris is glowing green, which never happens in the game, showing it's reacting and it's going to kill you if you get any closer. This is the co-op test. If you see the empty room as the player is not suffering and deny the reality of your partner, they're going to suffer a dramatic escalation in symptoms because the dissociation of realities will do that. However, if you work with them and are patient, you can make it to the next part. This is debris bust moment. What do you do? In this particular case, of course, you are patient. You trust the sufferer. You show compassion and empathy and maintain their trust until things go down. Now, this is at the end of the game. Leading up to this point is a long kind of gradual divergence in realities. So it gets further and further apart as the game gets more intense. And this is where the player story and the explicit story come in. There's a great blog post by Hitbox team, the makers of Dust Force, on designing game narrative where they talk about the explicit and the player story. Very quickly, the explicit story is what the game is about. It's what you think about when you think of the word story. And in Debris, the explicit story is that you're stuck in an ice cave network and you're trying to reach the surface. The player story is your personal experience when playing the game, how you interpret the game put in front of you. And this is where co-op gets interesting. For example, each set of streamers that played through the co-op mode went through vastly different player stories. While the explicit story would change based on which delusion you choose, the player story had a whole different set of beats. So when the first hallucination happens, how do players react? When the divergence comes worrisome and more intense, then what? When reality becomes direct action, what do? How much communication happens between players? What type of communication? What is the tone? Do you get angry? Do you try to describe every deviation? Or do you eventually give up and go silent? We saw all these interactions play out. It's fascinating to see the player who wasn't experiencing psychosis realize that arguing over it doesn't help, and that starting to show compassion and work with the sufferer to make it through the game more efficiently, not because they know about psychosis or they know non-escalating intervention techniques, but because trying to mediate reality makes things worse. Worse because of the gameplay sequences we added, like the room, but also worse because of the pure interpersonal conflict. And these people are playing with their friends, not complete strangers. Now, of course, there's tension. People would doom their team by choosing to fight over differences, trying to establish a canonical reality. For a mainstream game, there's probably too much tension in some cases where the split would get in the way of everything and kind of be frustrating more than anything. But to get to the end of the game, it required players to deal with drastically different yet irreconcilable realities. Both realities are real, so acting with compassion and empathy is the only way forward. Working with a delusion, as counterintuitive as that sounds, is the way to the surface. Once you get to dry land, to fresh air, there are many pathways to care. Psychosis care and treatment is a huge issue and something our amazing medical and community partners are constantly tackling. For Debris, however, we hope to show that two people can overcome a crisis even when existence itself isn't familiar. So let's go back to the bus. I'm a bystander. Someone's experiencing a psychotic break. If I'm forced to intervene, to play, as some of us might be at some point in our lives, I still don't know exactly what to do. But I do know that overcoming a crisis is possible despite entirely separate realities. And I hope our players do too. Because, in co-op at least, if they made it to the surface, then they already kind of did. So, thank you.